So good morning, everyone. This weekend is the first of 3 weekends on this topic of the Tantric grounds and paths, which is part of the basic program, which started a couple of years ago, I think. Is that right? How many of you have been following the basic program from the beginning? Okay, good. How many modules have you done so far? And what? Okay. Okay, so you're getting towards the end of the basic program. Good. So I thought we could start with some meditation and then getting our mind into a positive intention, positive motivation for being here. So how to make this not make noise? It seems that when it rubs against my clothing, it makes noise. Is there a way to stop that? Just have to not move. Okay. So let's sit quietly. Make yourself comfortable. Try to sit with your back straight if you can, but let your shoulders relax. It might be helpful to take a few deep breaths, breathing in slowly, pausing for a moment, then let the breath go out slowly. Let any tension in your body or mind go out with the breath. So do that for 3 breaths. Breathing in slowly, deeply, as much as you can before it becomes uncomfortable. Pause for a moment, then exhale slowly, letting go of any tension. You can exhale through your mouth if you wish. And then resume your normal rate of breathing. Just allow the body to breathe in a natural way. Let go of any attempt to control your breathing. There's no need to do that. Just relax your body, relax your mind as much as possible. Just let the breath flow in and out. And then with your mind, with your awareness, be aware of the breath as it's coming in and going out. And if there are any thoughts in your mind that are not related to what we're doing here, thoughts of the past or the future, let them go, put them aside. Give yourself a break from your usual busy thoughts. Just let your mind rest right here, right now in the present, being aware of the breath coming in and going out. Now, see if you can bring into your mind the most positive motivation that you are able to. If you are familiar with the Bodhichitta motivation, the aspiration to become a Buddha, fully enlightened Buddha, in order to benefit all living beings. So if that's familiar and comfortable to you, you can bring that into your mind. I think that's your reason for being here today. But if you're not so familiar with or comfortable with that motivation, then try to have some kind of altruistic motivation. For example, just wanting to benefit others and the world as much as you can in your life, wanting to use your life in ways that are helpful and not harmful, and think that that is your reason for being here. You want to learn ways in which you can be more helpful. So those are just some suggestions, but feel free to find your own positive, altruistic motivation for being here. And then let's do the prayer of taking refuge and generating bodhicitta, page 27. So let's do it one time in English, one time in Tibetan, and then one more time in English. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through teaching the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodan Soki Chognam La Jangchu Bardu Dagni Kyap Suchi Dagi Chujin Gipe Sonam Ki Drola Penchir Sangye Drupar Sho. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. So, for this module of the basic program, I thought to use a text. You should have the first couple of pages of this text in your packet of materials. It should be the one that's stapled together, 4 pages. No, there's 2 that are stapled together, okay. Okay, one is at the top of the page. It says, Illumination of the Tantric Tradition, the principles of the grounds and paths of the 4 great secret classes of Tantra. So it's just 2 pages. And so this is a text by a Tibetan Lama, Chögyé Ngawang Palden. And it's a relatively short, simple, well, relatively, I say, simple explanation of Tantra. And there's this book, some of you may have seen, it's called Principles of Buddhist Tantra, published by Wisdom Publications. And what it is this text plus commentary by Kirti Tsencho Rinpoche, a wonderful Lama. He's passed away now, but very great scholar and Lama. So he gave commentary to this text in California some years ago, and it was translated and published in this book. So if you are planning to follow this course all the way through, I strongly recommend getting a copy of this book. You can get it hardback. There's also ebook you can get from Wisdom Publications, a PDF that you can have on your computer. So either way, it's a good thing to get. It's a very good explanation of this text. And for this weekend, I thought hopefully we'll be able to get through just the first chapter of this text. So that's why we've photocopied it. But this text kind of jumps right into Tantra without giving a lot of background. So what I'm going to do first is go through some basic information about Tantra that it's good to know, it's important to know. And what happens with many people, including myself, and I think many other Western people who get involved in Tibetan Buddhism, we find ourselves kind of jumping into Tantra in the sense of taking initiations. Sometimes we are strongly encouraged to take initiations, even if we don't feel quite ready for it. We just it's like being thrown into the deep end of a swimming pool. We find ourselves with this initiation and these practices to do and don't really understand what it's all about. So this is what happened to me, and I know it happens to many other people as well. And in my case, it was only after many, many, many years of taking initiations and doing Tantra practice that I had a chance to study Tantra. So I did this, I followed the master's program in Instituto Lama Tsongkhapa, Italy, some years ago. And one of the topics, one of the subjects that we studied was this one. So I was really thankful after so many years to finally understand what Tantra is all about, the philosophy behind it, the general structure of Tantra, and so on. So that's why I think we're very fortunate that we have the chance to learn this. And also another little tricky thing is that traditionally it's said that in order to study Tantra, one has to first receive an initiation, which maybe that was okay for the Tibetans because they grew up in a culture where everybody practiced Tantra. It was all over the place. And they were quite familiar with Tantra, probably from the time they come out of the womb. But for us, Westerners, we don't have that, most of us anyway, don't have that kind of experience of, we grow up in a non-Buddhist family, non-Buddhist culture, and we only come to Buddhism when we're in our teens or 20s or 30s or later. And so there's many things about Buddhism that are unfamiliar to us. So to make a requirement that before you can learn about Tantra, you have to first take an initiation is a little uncomfortable. And so some lamas, for example, Geshe Tashi, it's included in his program. Some of you have probably done the Foundation of Buddhist Thought. So one of those modules is Tantra. And it's not required that you take an initiation in order to study that. And also there's so many books available that anybody could just pick up and read. And of course, there's all kinds of information on the internet. So, it's possible to learn about Tantra before taking an initiation. And many of us feel that really makes sense, that you know what you're doing, you know what you're getting yourself in for before you take an initiation. Because once you take an initiation, you have all these vows, commitments, practices you have to do, and then it's sort of like too late to decide later that you don't want to do this. So. Also, I've heard His Holiness say that there's so much misinformation about Tantra. And there's all these ideas, and of course all kinds of courses and retreats and so on about Tantra, which are not really accurate. They're not presenting the accurate teachings of Tantra. And so he says it's much better that people have access to the correct information about Tantra and have a correct understanding of it to counteract this misunderstanding. So, so this course then is being given to you without the requirement that you take an initiation. But my hope, my wish is that you at least have a good understanding, good basic understanding of Buddhism, and and respect for Buddhism and respect for Tantra, so that you're not going to, later criticize or, spread misinformation about these teachings. Because this is one of the reasons for the sort of secrecy of Tantra, is that if people who are not properly qualified to know about Tantra, if they get hold of this information, they could distort it, they could misrepresent it, which is what's been happening in the West. So before going into the text, I'm going to go through an outline. You should have a copy of this. It's one sheet of paper with two sides. On the top it says, Tantric Grounds and Paths, Jamyang Buddhist Centre Basic Program, Introductory Outline. Okay, so this is just to go through some of the more basic material. Perhaps some of you, for some of you, this is things you already know, but I just wanted to make sure, in case there were somewhat newish people here, that that you have a good understanding, a basic understanding, before we jump into the text. Okay, so first of all, we'll look at the place of Tantra within Buddhism. Where does Tantra fit in Buddhism? So point A, letter A, mentions two main divisions of Buddhism. So these are divisions that, in one sense, we could say they developed historically, but they also have some differences in terms of their basic teachings and practices. But the main difference is in terms of the goal that one is working towards. So the first division, in many texts, it's known as Hinayana. Sometimes this is translated as lesser vehicle or smaller vehicle, but perhaps a nicer translation is the individual vehicle. And this is the kind of Buddhism that is found nowadays mostly in Southeast Asian countries, Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and so forth. And there they don't use the term Hinayana, they don't call themselves Hinayana, but they use the term Tera Vaada. But historically, Tera Vaada is actually one school of Buddhism that developed after the time of the Buddha. And from the Buddhist point of view, I'm not a scholar of Buddhism, but it's quite complex, all the different schools of Buddhism that developed over the centuries after the Buddha passed away. So there's many others besides the Tera Vaada that the Mahayanists would consider to be included in the Hinayana. And there's a lot of discussion about this term Hinayana. You do find it in many texts, and also teachers tend to use it. I just recently heard the Dalai Lama say he thinks we should stop using this term because it's somewhat derogatory. And he has been using other terms based on the kind of language that is used in the scriptures. So in the Hinayana or Tera Vaada scriptures, they use the Pali language. So the so-called original teachings of the Buddha were preserved in Pali language. So His Holiness talks about the Pali tradition. The Pali tradition is that tradition that's found in the Southeast Asian countries. And then the Mahayana, the language the scriptures are preserved in is Sanskrit. So he uses the term Sanskrit tradition. So there's the Pali tradition, the Sanskrit tradition. So those are the terms that His Holiness uses. But in a footnote in one of Jeffrey Hopkins' books, he says that the term Hinayana is actually not meant to be derogatory. And in fact, for example, in the Mahayana tradition and the Tibetan tradition, many of the practices that we do, such as the vows that are taken by monks and nuns. Also, if you're a layperson, you take refuge and you take the 5 precepts. So those vows are part of that tradition. They are preserved in that tradition. And also in the monasteries of, for example, the Gelugpa monasteries like Sera, Ganden, and so forth, many of the texts that they study, the subjects that they study, also are part of this tradition. So the teachings, the main teachings and practices of the Hinayana or Tera Vaada or Pali tradition, whatever you want to call it, form the foundation for the Mahayana. Yeah, so it wouldn't be right for us to be derogatory, to be critical or look down upon those teachings and practices, because they are necessary for our own tradition. They're necessary teachings and practices for us. Anyway, there's a lot of controversy about this, and I'm not going to go into it all. But the main difference between these two traditions of Buddhism is the goal that one is working towards. So in the first one, Hinayana, individual vehicle, Pali tradition, whatever you want to call it, the main goal of one's practice is the attainment of nirvana, which means complete liberation from suffering and its causes. Getting oneself out of this situation that we are in, which we call samsara or cyclic existence, getting ourselves out of this situation, getting ourselves to a situation of peace, freedom from suffering, freedom from the causes of suffering, bliss. Yeah. So getting oneself out. It's sometimes called, this goal is sometimes called self-liberation, because one's goal is just to liberate oneself from suffering, and one doesn't think in terms of helping everybody else to get out of suffering. So just each person getting themselves out of suffering. And then in the Mahayana, which is usually translated as the great vehicle or sometimes the universal vehicle, the goal of this path is enlightenment, Buddhahood. And the reason or purpose for reaching enlightenment is to help all other sentient beings. So that's where we have the Bodhisattva ideal, Bodhisattva being somebody who is working for enlightenment to help all living beings. And so the real goal, the real purpose is helping others. Bodhisattva is someone who has incredible great compassion and love and dedication to others. So that's what the Bodhisattva really wants to do, is to help others. And then attaining Buddhahood or attaining enlightenment is a means to do that. Okay, so in order to help others, you realize you've got to get yourself together. You've got to develop your own abilities to help others. So the best way you can help others is by becoming a Buddha, meaning your mind is completely free of all negativities, delusions, and obscurations, and suffering, and so forth. And you also develop your positive abilities, your positive potentials to the utmost degree, to the highest degree, to the state of perfection. And that's actually the meaning of the Tibetan term for Buddha, which is the first part of my name, Sangye. So Sangye, the term Sang means pure or clear, and it means the Buddha's mind is totally pure, totally clear of everything that is negative or problematic or obstructive. The second syllable, Gye, means developed or expanded, and it refers to the complete perfection, fulfillment of all the positive qualities, love, compassion, wisdom, patience, and so forth. So those have been fully developed, fully perfected to the highest degree. So then a Buddha, a Sangye, which I have that name, but it's not me. Okay, I'm not a Buddha. I just want to make that clear. I'm hoping to get there one day, but I'm a long way off. So a Sangye is a person, a being who has developed their mind to the highest degree, completely free of everything negative, problematic, fully developed, and everything positive. So it's the highest state of mind that's possible. And in that state of mind include all these amazing abilities and qualities that one can use to benefit others. And also there's just unlimited energy. Like all of us have the interest and energy to help others sometimes, but we get tired and we need coffee breaks and we need to sleep and take holidays and so forth. But a Buddha doesn't need any of those. A Buddha can work like constantly 24 hours a day without getting tired or bored or needing a break, and just constantly helping others. So that's the goal of the Mahayana. And then so Tibetan Buddhism is included in Mahayana. And Mahayana is also found in many other countries as well: Japan, China, Korea, Vietnam, Mongolia. So Mahayana Buddhism, kind of geographically spread more in the northern part of Asia, northern and eastern part of Asia, whereas the Tera Vaada or Hinayana Buddhism tended to spread more in the southern part of Asia. Okay, so Mahayana, then point B, has two divisions. The first is Paramitayana, which translates as perfection vehicle, and another term for that is Sutrayana, or sutra vehicle. So Paramitayana, Sutrayana are synonymous. They're just two different names for the same division of Mahayana. And the second division is the Vajrayana, or Tantra. So I wanted to emphasize this because some people have the idea that Tantra or Vajrayana is some separate vehicle. Sometimes they say there's three vehicles. There's the Hinayana and the Mahayana and the Vajrayana, or Tantra, as if it's separate. But it's actually not. It's a division of Mahayana. It's a part of Mahayana. And we'll look a little bit later at the differences between these two, Paramitayana and the Vajrayana. How do they differ? But before we do that, letter C is the three principal aspects of the path. And it said that these are the three main practices that we need to understand, and not just understand intellectually, but integrate in our mind, integrate in our life, as the basis of both Tantric practice and Mahayana and Paramitayana practice. So within the Mahayana, whether you're practicing Paramitayana, Sutrayana, or you're practicing Tantra, Vajrayana, you need to have these three principal aspects of the path. So you've probably heard these before, but it doesn't hurt to go through them again and just make sure that we have a good understanding of them. The first one is renunciation. And that term can sometimes have a connotation that may not be very attractive. It may sound like you have to give up happiness, give up pleasure, giving up enjoyments, and just live an ascetic life, sitting in a cold cave and, eating only bread and water. So maybe some people have that idea about renunciation. And so another term, and this is actually a more correct translation of the term in Tibetan, is the determination to be free. The determination to be free. So that might have a little bit better connotation. And just to read, one of my teachers, Kensur Jamba Tekchok, who there's a number of his books available. One is called Insight into Emptiness, a really wonderful book about emptiness. And in that book he says, renunciation does not mean giving up happiness. It means renouncing dukkha. Dukkha is the Pali and Sanskrit word for suffering or unsatisfactoriness. So that's what we are renouncing. That's what we are trying to remove from our life, from our experience. Suffering and its causes. Okay, so all the painful, problematic, unsatisfactory conditions of life, of samsara, that's what we are renouncing, not, nice food and living in a nice place and so on. So it's mainly a state of mind. It's a mental state, and it doesn't have to do with where you live or what kind of food you eat or what kind of lifestyle you have and so forth. So there's two types of renunciation. One is renunciation of this life. Now, the meaning of that is mainly renouncing our attachment to exclusively this life. Have you heard of the 8 worldly dharmas, the 8 worldly concerns? This is a common theme in the... I think it's all throughout Buddhism, not just Tibetan Buddhism. Can any of you mention any of these 8 worldly concerns? Gain and loss. Pleasure and pain. Praise and blame. Reputation and lack of, or opposite. Yeah. So the 8 worldly concerns are they're really attitudes of being concerned about or attached to certain things. So there's 4 pairs of these. So the first pair is gain and loss, meaning that you're very attached to gain and very attached to not losing. So you want to gain and you don't want to lose. So this can manifest in different ways, such as just personal concern about being wealthy, having more and more and more and more, like we have in our consumer societies. Gain can also mean, people giving us things. We're really happy if people give us things, if people make gifts to us. So any kind of gain, whether we do it ourselves or it comes our way. We want to gain. We want to have more and more and more, mainly in terms of material things, material money, property, things, and so forth. And then the opposite of that is loss. And it's, again, mainly in terms of material things. We don't want to lose money or things that we have. We don't want to lose, status and so forth. So we can observe these experiences in our life, whether we have these concerns or not. There's a sense of joy and happiness when we do get something, or whether we buy it for ourselves or it's given to us. And then whenever we lose something, we lose one of our possessions, or get stolen or broken, or we fail to get something that we want, some material thing. And if we feel unhappy about that, upset about that, then this shows that we are still caught up in that concern. And then the second pair, although there's different orders of these, praise and blame. So we like to be praised. We like people to, point out our good attributes, our achievements, say, complimentary words to us. When that kind of thing happens, we feel happy, and, we're sort of craving for that. And this can also show up if somebody else is being praised and we feel unhappy or jealous, envious. We want some of that praise too. So then we can see that we're still concerned about that. And then the opposite of that is blame or criticism. So that's when we get the opposite kind of words. Instead of praise, we are criticized, we are blamed, we are, insulted. So when that kind of word comes our way, then, if we feel unhappy, depressed, miserable, that shows that we're still concerned about that. So it's actually quite difficult to be free of these 8 worldly concerns. I can see in myself, these things still happening. But we can work on them. There are things we can do to work on them. Let me just finish going through them. And then there's pleasure and pain. So when we have pleasant experiences, feeling comfortable in our body, having nice food to eat, having beautiful things to look at, and sounds to hear, and so forth. So any kind of pleasant experience that happens, if we feel excited, happy, attached to that, wanting more of that, then that shows we're still caught up in that concern. And the opposite is pain, or it could be physical pain. It could also be unpleasant experiences, unpleasant smells or sights or sounds. Okay, so if that makes us upset, unhappy, and so on, it shows we still have that concern. And then the last pair is about fame or reputation and the lack of it, or the opposite to that. And it's somewhat similar to praise and blame, but one explanation was that praise and blame is more about what people say to your face, in your presence, whereas reputation and the lack of it is more what people say behind your back about you elsewhere. Okay. It's natural that we want people to think well of us, to have a good reputation. People are saying good things about us, thinking good things about us, and so on. So if that is happening, then we're happy, we feel good about that. But if the opposite happens, if we find out that people are criticizing us behind our back, telling stories about us, whatever, or we have a bad reputation, or I also think of zero reputation, like you're a nobody. Nobody knows who you are, what you've done, what you've achieved, what you've accomplished, and so on. So that's also can be a cause of feeling somewhat unhappy and depressed. So if we're still caught up in concern about these 8 things, wanting the pleasant ones and not wanting the unpleasant ones, then this attitude is said to be attachment to this life. The term attachment to this life means attachment to these 8 worldly concerns. And why is this a problem? From the Buddhist point of view, although this is a controversial topic, many Westerners have difficulty with this, this is not the only life that we have. This is only one life in a long series of lives. We've had many lives before this. We will have probably many lives after this. So this is just one single life in a long series. And the lives that we will have later on, next time when this life ends, and then after that, and so on and so forth, it isn't a question of choice. It's not that we get to choose where we will be born and the circumstances of our life and so forth, but it's a result of our karma. It's a result of our actions, our behavior in this life, but also the karma we've created in the past. And so if we create positive karma, good karma, virtuous karma, we are creating the cause to have fortunate rebirths in our future lives. Again, being born as a human being, having good conditions, and so on and so forth, and being able to progress further on the path towards liberation or enlightenment. But on the other hand, if we create negative karma, bad karma, then we're creating the cause to possibly have a worse situation in the next life. Maybe not even as a human being, maybe as some lower form of life, such as an animal or a cockroach or a hungry ghost. There's even worse situations than animal. So we are the creators of our own future. How we live our life, what we do with our life, what we do with our energy, we are creating the cause for what happens to us in the future. And human life, from the point of view of Buddhism, is very precious, very rare, and also very precious in the sense that we can either, improve and get better, get closer to liberation, closer to enlightenment, Or we can, waste our time, or even worse, create a lot of negativity, a lot of suffering for others and for ourselves. So the Buddhist view is it's very, very important to use our life well, do actions that will be, the cause for good rebirths and eventually liberation and enlightenment, so that we're benefiting ourselves, but then this also becomes beneficial for others. If we live our life in that way, it will also be beneficial for others as well as ourselves. And if, on the other hand, we use our life in ways that just create more suffering for ourselves and more suffering for others, then it's not very wise, not a good use of our time. So these 8 worldly concerns can become the motivation, the motivating factor for us to use our life unwisely. So if we have strong attachment to pleasure, praise, fame, gain, and so forth, then this can motivate us to engage in negative or non-virtuous actions. As hear in the news every day, people behaving in ways that are corrupt, they're telling lies, they're cheating, doing whatever they can to increase their own wealth and status and so forth, and not being concerned about others. So this will be considered a very unwise, unskillful use of our life. And not only that, but in the future, we'll go down rather than up. We'll degenerate rather than improve ourselves. So the meaning of this first type of renunciation of this life, mainly means renouncing the kind of attitudes that would cause us to live our life unwisely, unskillfully, creating just more causes of suffering for ourselves and others, rather than using our life to, work towards higher states like liberation and enlightenment. So in the Lamrim, the stages of the path, the meditations that one does in order to develop this kind of renunciation would be the preciousness of our human life, and how important it is to use this human life for Dharma practice, spiritual practice. And then that's followed by meditating on death, how death is inevitable, and it could happen at any time. We don't know when it is going to happen. This life could end at any point in time, and therefore it's very important for us to, whatever positive things we want to do with our life, we need to do them now and not postpone, later on when I've retired and finished all these other things, then I'll start getting serious about spiritual practice. So having that kind of attitude is a little dangerous, because we really don't know how long we have, how much time we have. So if we do see the value of spiritual practice, then we should at least start doing it now, at least some practice every day. And then the possibility of taking rebirth in an unfortunate situation in our next life. That's an often difficult subject for many Westerners. There tends to be a lot of resistance to that. And what I think is, if it's difficult to believe in unfortunate rebirths, to these other realms that we could be reborn in, if we just look at this human world, and there's situations in this human world that would be really terrible to be born into. There's hell-like experiences in this world. There's hungry ghost-like experiences in this world. There's animal-like experiences in this world. So we can see human beings born into situations where they have those kinds of experiences, those kinds of sufferings. Okay, so this is something we can't deny. It's there, it's around us, it's a fact of life in this world. So you could think about those kinds of experiences and what it would be like if you were born in a situation like that. And hopefully that will give rise to a strong wish not to be born in such situations. And the way to prevent that, avoid that, is to make sure that the actions that we do, the karma that we create in this lifetime are positive ones, are good ones, such as, avoiding the 10 non-virtuous actions, creating the 10 virtuous actions, trying to be as kind and caring and giving and patient and so forth as we can in our life. So looking after our karma, basically. So those are the topics that are involved in this first type of renunciation. And also taking refuge, although that isn't absolutely necessary in order to have a good rebirth in the next life, because people following other religions, non-Buddhist religions, also have the ability to live their life in ways that are virtuous and positive and create the cause for good rebirths in the next life. But if you are attracted to the Buddhist path, then refuge would also be a factor in living, the way in which you live your life, to make sure that, where you're going after this life will be a good situation rather than a bad situation. So does that make sense, the meaning of renunciation of this life? It doesn't mean renouncing happiness and pleasure and comfort and enjoying yourself. But mainly it's renouncing the attitudes, the states of mind that would lead you to living your life in ways that you are creating non-virtue rather than virtue. You're creating negative karma rather than positive karma. Does that make sense? If you do have questions about any of this, there'll be time later in the afternoon for you to ask questions. And then the second type of renunciation is renunciation of samsara. Samsara meaning cyclic existence. It's the big painting outside the door of the Wheel of Life, which depicts samsara, the situation of those of us who are not enlightened or haven't reached nirvana, liberation. So it's characterized by having to die and then take rebirth again and again and again, without choice, without control, but rather it's our karma, the karma that we create, that sort of throws us back into another rebirth. So if we have more virtuous karma, then the rebirths we have are positive ones. If we have more non-virtuous karma, then it throws us into unfortunate rebirth. But even if we have good rebirths as a human being, or there are also higher realms than human, the Deva realms, where there's incredible bliss, much, much better than where we are. But even in these so-called good rebirths, good situations, there's still suffering. We're not completely free of suffering. It's still an unsatisfactory and unfree situation. I like to think of samsara being like a prison. That's the analogy that's sometimes used. Within a prison, you can sometimes have really horrible experiences, like if you have a sadistic guard who, taunts you, humiliates you, beats you, treats you horribly, or other prisoners who are very violent and aggressive and beat you up. So those would be horrible experiences in a prison. But you may sometimes have nice experiences. If you have a friend, a buddy, and you get together with your friend and play cards or watch a movie or listen to music, enjoy yourself, or you have we have the potential to experience unbelievable peace and bliss and freedom and, states of mind that we can't even imagine right now. So we have that ability, have that potential, but we have to get ourselves out of this situation. We got ourselves into this situation, not deliberately, intentionally, but because our mind is not free from the causes of suffering, which are mainly delusions, mainly the three poisonous minds of greed or craving, desire, attachment, hatred, anger, irritation, aggressiveness, And then ignorance or confusion, bewilderment, which means we don't know the true nature of things. We are unaware of the way in which things exist, and instead of seeing things the way they exist, we see them in an opposite way. We see them as existing in a way that's totally opposite to how they really do exist. So these are the main factors that keep us in the prison of samsara. And these are the very things we need to free ourselves from in order to get out of samsara. But first, we have to feel the wish to. We have to have the wish to get out of samsara. We have to see that the situation we are in is unsatisfactory, is suffering, is imperfect, is, not a good place for us. And we have to wish to get out. Because I've heard that sometimes prisoners, people who've been in prison for a long time, become somewhat institutionalized, and they get so used to being in prison that even when they have the chance to get out, they don't know how to manage. They don't, they're not comfortable living outside of prison. So again, they commit a crime to get themselves back in because they're so comfortable in prison. So it's a little bit like ourselves, we're so kind of institutionalized to samsara. We've been here for so long, and, maybe we feel a little bit comfortable, at least with the pleasant experiences. Of course, we don't want the unpleasant ones, but, we want the pleasant ones. And we don't really want to get ourselves out of it. So that's why the Buddha first, in his teachings, taught suffering. The very first thing he taught in the first teaching, the Four Noble Truths, was suffering. So we have to see suffering. We have to realize there is suffering in the world, and not just out there, but right here. My own existence is totally caught up with suffering, with unsatisfactoriness. It's there. The suffering is there. We have to recognize it. We have to realize it. We have to generate this wish to be free of our suffering, to get ourselves out of the situation of suffering. So that's the meaning of renunciation of samsara. We have to understand what samsara is, recognize it, recognize how unsatisfactory it is, and then if we really see that, naturally, it gives rise to the wish to get out, the wish to be free. So this is a very important point. It's essential to have this as the basis of our practice, whether you're following the Sutrayana or Parmitayana path, or you're following the Vajrayana Tantra path. Either one, we need this understanding of samsara, the situation of samsara, how unsatisfactory it is, and the strong determination to be free, to free ourselves from it. And it's said that before we can really develop bodhicitta, which is the second of the three principal aspects of the path, this is the attitude of wanting to help all sentient beings, help them all to be free. So if we don't have the first one, renunciation, then there's no way we can really have the second one, bodhicitta. Because bodhicitta, we could say bodhicitta is actually applying renunciation to every other being as well. Yeah, we have to recognize that everybody else who is in samsara, all the other beings who are in samsara, are suffering. They're in an unsatisfactory, undesirable, imperfect situation, and we want to help all of them to become free. And we want to do it ourselves. We want to get them out of this situation. Well, if we haven't even developed the wish to free ourselves from samsara, then how can we have the wish to free everybody else from samsara, right? So, I mean, in a way, I think this isn't part of the traditional teachings, but there's a lot of talk nowadays about self-compassion, the importance of self-compassion, which is important for Westerners, because there are many Westerners who don't have compassion for themselves and instead have the opposite, a very negative view of themselves, negative attitudes towards themselves, of being self-hating, self-critical, self-judgmental, being hard on themselves, and so on. So out of this has arisen a whole movement to teach compassion, self-compassion. It's also said that, we need to have compassion for ourselves before we can really have compassion for others. But in the traditional teachings, at least in the Tibetan tradition, you don't find any mention of self-compassion, that terminology. But I think renunciation is actually self-compassion, because the idea of renunciation is you recognize you are in an imperfect situation. You've got problems, you've got difficulties, you've got suffering. You haven't developed yourself to your fullest extent. And you don't deserve this. We don't deserve to suffer. We shouldn't have to suffer. And so we should get ourselves, nobody else is going to do it for us, unfortunately. In Buddhism, it's not that we pray to God or we pray to some external being, external deity who's very powerful, and it will, pick us up and deposit us in some wonderful situation. So it's not like that in Buddhism. We have to get ourselves out. We have to do it ourselves. But we have to have the wish to do it. We have to feel, I don't deserve to suffer. I shouldn't have to suffer. I don't want to suffer. I want to get myself out of suffering. Okay, so that's what renunciation is. And doesn't that sound like self-compassion? Because compassion, according to Buddhism, is the wish to free others from suffering. But of course, we also have that for ourselves. So if it's self-compassion, that means it's the wish to free ourselves from suffering, the wish to get ourselves out of suffering. Okay? Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Yeah? So I think in a way we can say that self-compassion does exist in the traditional teachings. It's right here, the first of the three principal aspects of the path. Renunciation, or determination to free ourselves from suffering, all the different kinds of suffering and its causes. Okay, getting ourselves out of this situation. And then once we have that down, then we can apply that to others. We can extend that to others and have real compassion for others, which is the basis for bodhicitta. Okay, so bodhicitta is the second of the three principal aspects of the path. And that means the aspiration to become enlightened, to help all living beings. And probably for most people, this isn't something that just arises naturally and spontaneously. It's not something that we're born with. We hear about it when we encounter the Buddha's teachings, and if we feel inspired, if we feel this is a beautiful idea. For example, when I first began learning Buddhism, I was in Dharamsala in the early 70s, and studying at the Tibetan library, learning about the path to enlightenment. And this is the thing that really struck me. I just thought, wow, bodhicitta, wanting to help all living beings, wanting to become enlightened, bring yourself to enlightenment, to help all living beings. I thought, what an amazing idea. I couldn't imagine anything more wonderful than that. So I was very inspired, very attracted to this idea of bodhicitta. So it includes compassion and love, but it goes beyond just compassion and love. Compassion is wanting others to be free of suffering, and love is wanting others to be happy. But one goes further than just wanting that or wishing that. One takes on a sense of responsibility, you sort of shoulder the responsibility. I am going to do it. I'm going to do whatever it takes, whatever can be done to make sure that others have the happiness they wish for and are free from the suffering they wish to be free from. So bodhicitta is something that can be developed. If it isn't there naturally, spontaneously, we can develop it. There are different methods for developing bodhicitta. One of the methods, which is found in Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, the Bodhicharyavatara, is called the method of equalizing and exchanging self and others. And it has 5 kind of points that you meditate on. The first one is meditating on the equality of self and others, meaning that, the most simple idea is we are all the same, or we are all equal in that we all want to be happy and we all do not want to suffer. So it's a kind of simple idea, but it's very profound if we meditate on that, if we think about individual people, individual beings, and how each one of them is basically just like me. They want to be happy and they don't want to suffer. And there's a book by Jeffrey Hopkins. I don't know if you've heard of Jeffrey Hopkins, but he's a great scholar, Tibetan, Sanskrit. He's written a number of books, especially on emptiness. There's a book he wrote, I think it's called A Truthful Heart, or something like that, which is about bodhicitta, basically. So it's a really nice change from his emptiness books. And he says that, sorry. His very first teacher was a Mongolian Lama who lived in New Jersey. And this was back in the 60s when there weren't many Tibetan Lamas teaching and not many Westerners learning from Tibetan Lamas. But anyway, the first practice that he was taught by his teacher was this one, was meditating on the equality of self and others. And he said sometimes he would just sit up all night. He wouldn't sleep. He'd just sit there all night. And he'd go through all the people in his life, starting from the beginning of his life, his mother, his father, his brother, and so on, and all the people he's ever known in his life, and just think, each person, this person just wants to be happy and doesn't want to suffer, just like me. And then the next one, and the next one. And I thought, wow, that would be quite extraordinary to really go through all the people you have ever known and all the people you know now, and including the people you don't know, the strangers out there in the streets, and the people you don't like, the politicians, and so on and so forth. So just one by one, each and every person. This person just wants to be happy and doesn't want to suffer. And it's good to try to really feel that, to contemplate that until it clicks in your mind. You really experience it. Yeah. They just want to be happy and they don't want to suffer. Because this is a really important basis for compassion and love. Yeah, we have to realize, we have to really clearly see, clearly feel, nobody wants to suffer. Nobody wants pain or problems or suffering, just as I don't. And just as I want to be happy and have good experiences and so forth, everybody else feels the same way. Not just human beings, animals, insects, every living being, every sentient being that has a mind. This is what they feel in their mind. They don't want to suffer, they want to be happy. So it really makes quite a profound effect on the mind. Anyway, so that's the first step in this method for developing bodhicitta. The second step is to contemplate the disadvantages of being self-centered, having an attitude of me first. I am more important than everybody else. I am the center of the universe. So we all have this to a certain extent. Some people may have it more, some people may have it less, but it's there in all of us, this me first attitude. And even though it's sort of natural, instinctive, intuitive, but from the Buddhist point of view, especially in the Mahayana, it's a problem, having this attitude, because it's an obstacle to us really developing bodhicitta, compassion, love, and dedicating ourselves to others. So it's said that for someone who wants to follow the Bodhisattva's path, this is one of the main obstacles, one of the things that needs to be overcome, the me first attitude. So we look at how it leads us to problems. Whenever we do something negative, for example, killing or stealing or lying or cheating or just being greedy, it's based on this attitude, me first, putting ourselves first before others, thinking of me as more important than others. And It keeps us in samsara, prevents us from even liberating ourselves from samsara, achieving, the peace of nirvana. And of course, it's an obstacle to attaining enlightenment. So I'm just briefly mentioning it, but in the teachings, it mentions quite a few disadvantages of that attitude, it's usually called self-cherishing. That term self-cherishing is a little bit tricky, because if we think, oh, self-cherishing is bad, we shouldn't cherish ourselves, then it can sound like we shouldn't be kind to ourselves. We shouldn't be nice to ourselves. We should beat ourselves up, which is what a lot of people do anyway. So some people have the idea that maybe instead of saying self-cherishing, better to say self-centeredness or self-importance, right? Just to make it clear that we should be kind to ourselves. We should cherish ourselves. But the point is to not be self-centered, self-obsessed, self-focused to the extent of ignoring others. And then the next step is contemplating the opposite attitude of cherishing others or being altruistic or being unselfish. So that kind of attitude of putting others first, considering others as important and dear and to be taken care of. So that kind of attitude is very positive, very beneficial. And a simple way of doing this is just to look at our own experience. Bring to mind times when we were more selfish, when we acted in a selfish way, and then times when we acted in a more unselfish way, where we really thought about others and put others first. So just compare those two kinds of experiences and what it was like. How did it feel? How did you yourself feel? How did it affect others? So just looking at that, I think we can clearly see that, when we act selfishly, even if it means we get the biggest piece of cake, but, does that really bring satisfaction and peace and happiness, Does it really bring long-term happiness, genuine happiness? Probably gives you a bigger tummy as well. And then if, on the other hand, you let somebody else have the biggest piece of cake and you're happy for them, So how does that feel? So I think we can see that being more altruistic as opposed to self-centered is more satisfying for ourselves and for others. So then after comparing those two attitudes, if we come to the conclusion that, I would like to be less self-centered and more altruistic, more concerned for others, then the next step, the fourth step, is called exchanging self for others, which means exchanging your attitude, changing your attitude, deciding to work on your mind so that you're less self-centered, less focused on me, and more focused on others. And of course, this is something that takes time. It's a gradual process. It's not something we can immediately change right away. But if we do see that as important and put our energy into it gradually, then we will see changes happening. And the fifth step is the practice of tonglen, or taking and giving, which is a practice that will help us to do this, will help us to be less self-centered, more concerned for others. So you've probably all heard about the practice of tonglen and done the practice. Has anyone not heard of it? Anyone unfamiliar with tonglen, what tonglen is? Okay, we're going to go to 11:30 and then we'll have a break. But maybe it would be nice to do some meditation rather than me just talking. So let's do some meditation on some of these ideas. Can you hear me okay? Is the microphone okay? So make yourself comfortable, but try to sit up straight, because having a straight back can help the mind to be more focused, alert, clear, awake. But at the same time, try to be relaxed. If you do feel any tension anywhere in your body, see if you can just let it melt and flow away, flow out of you, drain out of you. You can imagine it sinking into the earth beneath us, where it disappears. Leaving your body as light, clear, free of tension as possible. And then for a few moments, be aware of your breathing. Let your mind simply observe the breath, the natural, gentle rhythm of the breath, flowing in, flowing out. Bring your mind back to the breath anytime it wanders away. So by watching the breath, our mind settles down in the here and now, right here, right now, which is what's the only thing that's really happening. The past is over, the future hasn't yet happened. So it's really just the present that is happening. So stay in the present, aware of the breath flowing in, flowing out. So now spend a few minutes, contemplating the first of the Four Noble Truths taught by the Buddha, the truth of suffering, which means suffering is a fact of life. So just check to see if this is something you can identify in your own life. Right now in your life, you may have problems, difficulties, or even if that's not the case, there have been times in your life when you had problems and difficulties. But just see if you can accept the truth of suffering in your own life, that suffering is a natural, inevitable part of life. So the Buddha didn't talk about suffering and ask us to look at suffering in order to make us depressed or feel pessimistic, in despair. So if that kind of thing happens, then that's not looking at suffering in the right way, because suffering isn't something permanent and fixed, something that will last forever, cannot be avoided, cannot be escaped from. Just the contrary. Suffering is impermanent, not permanent. It comes and goes. And it has causes. There are causes of suffering. There are reasons why suffering happens. And those causes are also impermanent, not permanent. And it's possible to overcome them, to eliminate them, to become free of them. The main causes of suffering are attitudes in our mind, especially what are called the three poisons, or three mental toxins of greed, or also called attachment, desire, craving. That's when we're not satisfied, but always wanting more and more, and wanting to hang on to things, hoping they'll last forever. The second of the three poisons is anger, which has many levels, from mild irritation, impatience, or dislike, to hatred and aggressiveness that can motivate people to acts of violence. There's many variations of anger, but that's another main cause of suffering. And then the most important cause of suffering, the root one, is ignorance, not knowing the true nature of things, our own self, who we are, what we are, and others, and the things in the world around us. We see everything in a mistaken way, incorrect way, other than how it really is. So it's like we're confused, basically confused, unaware, unknowing. And because of that, we develop these other attitudes, like attachment, anger, and also jealousy and pride and so on. And under the influence of these disturbing mental states, we act, we create karma, which then becomes the cause of us being stuck in samsara, cyclic existence. But the good news is it's possible to free ourselves from these mental toxins, and then free ourselves from karma, and free ourselves from this whole situation of samsara. And just see if that sounds like something you would like to do. You can feel the sense of what's called renunciation, or the determination to be free. Having the determination to get yourself out of this situation, out of suffering, out of samsara. So if we are able to generate that attitude of wanting to free ourselves from samsara, that's really fantastic. It's wonderful. But from the point of view of Mahayana, it's still somewhat limited, because we're only thinking about one person, me. And it is good if we can get ourselves out of samsara, but it's even better if we can extend that attitude to others. It's a bit like you're trapped in a building that's on fire and it's full of people. Of course, everybody wants to get out. And if we do find a way to get out of this burning building, would it be right to just walk away and not do anything to help the other people who are still trapped inside? So the second of the three principal aspects is bodhicitta, and that's having the awareness that there are many other people, many other beings trapped in samsara, suffering, going around and around through the cycle of death and rebirth. And just as we want to be free of suffering, so do they. Just as we want peace and happiness, so do they. So opening up to that awareness is the first step towards developing bodhicitta, which is the wish to free not only ourselves, but everybody else from samsara. So just contemplate that for a few moments and see if you can feel attracted towards that, and if that's the kind of path you would like to follow. So those who do feel the wish to free not only themselves, but also other beings, and others meaning everybody, not choosing those you want to help and leaving out others, but all living beings without exception, because they all have the wish to be free of suffering, they all have the wish to be happy, and also, according to the Mahayana, they all have the ability, the potential, what we call Buddha nature. Buddha nature is our true nature, the true nature of our mind. The true nature of our mind is that it's not, suffering is not permanent. Delusions are not permanent, they're not fixed, but it's possible for the mind to be free of delusions, karma, suffering, samsara, and to reach the state of full enlightenment, just like the Buddha. So we all have that ability, we all have that potential. And bodhicitta means taking upon oneself the responsibility to make that happen. I'm going to get myself out of samsara and to enlightenment, Buddhahood, and then I'm going to help everybody else do the same. No matter how long it takes, I'm not going to give up, I'm not going to stop until every single living being has reached enlightenment as well. So it may sound like a lot of work, a hard job. It is, but it's doable, it's possible. Many others have already done it. Many others are doing it now. They're on their way. And we can do it too. Okay, so you can relax, open your eyes. So we're not yet Buddhas and we still need tea breaks, so let's have a tea break. So we'll start again in 15, 20 minutes.